The early morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling, manicured lawns of St. James's Palace. But for Sergeant Major Thomas Reese Williams, the beauty of the historic residence was a distant backdrop to a life of rigid monotony. At 43, Thomas cut a striking figure in his bearskin cap and scarlet tunic, a soldier of the King's Guard standing motionless outside Friary Court. To the thousands of tourists who stopped to photograph him, he was the quintessential symbol of British pageantry, a living doll in a perfect uniform. They saw the stoic face, the polished boots, the bayonet held at a perfect angle. They did not see the ghost of the man standing behind his eyes. Thomas's journey to this gilded cage had been long and brutal. 20 years prior, he had been a different kind of soldier altogether. He was a veteran of the Special Air Service, the SAS, the regiment whose very name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. He had operated in the shadows, in the dusty, blood-soaked alleyways of Iraq and the treacherous, poppy-filled valleys of Helmand Province in Afghanistan. He was a marksman of almost supernatural ability, a man whose role was to observe, to wait, and when the moment was right, to end a life with a single, devastatingly accurate shot from over a mile away. His world had been one of intense camaraderie, and of life and death decisions made in split seconds, of the constant, thrumming presence of mortal danger. He had held dying friends in his arms and had taken lives to save others. The weight of those memories was etched not on his face, but deep into his soul. The transition to civilian life, and then to this ceremonial posting, had been a peculiar kind of hell. After leaving the regiment, the silence of normal life was deafening. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. But he missed the team, the mission, the clarity of purpose. The palace guard posting was supposed to be a quiet, respectable end to a career, a way to finish his service with dignity. Instead, it felt like a slow erasure of his identity. He was no longer the ghost, the call sign his troop had given him for his ability to remain unseen. He was just a man in a big hat, a target for jokes and a prop for photographs. This painful disconnect was on full display during the quarterly marksmanship qualification at the Metropolitan Police's indoor range in Lippets Hill. For the soldiers of the King's Guard, this was a tedious formality. Their role was ceremonial. Their rifles, though functional, L-85A2s, were more often tools for drill than instruments of warfare. The atmosphere in the range's briefing room was jovial, laced with the casual arrogance of young men who had never been shot at. They chatted about football and weekend plans, their body language loose and unconcerned. Thomas, in his late 40s and with a quiet, unassuming demeanor, stood apart. He wore the same uniform as the others, but on him it seemed like a costume. He nursed a cup of lukewarm tea, his eyes a pale, piercing blue, quietly assessing the room. The exits, the other shooters, the safety procedures pinned to the wall. It was an unconscious habit, our survival instinct, that 20 years of service had hardwired into his very being. The loudest voice in the room belonged to Corporal Danny Deakins, a brash, stocky man in his late 20s. Deakins was the epitome of the guardhouse lawyer, a man who had never seen a day of real conflict, but carried himself with the swagger of a grizzled veteran. He was the unofficial leader of the younger soldiers, and his primary target for ridicule was the quiet, older sergeant major. Right then, "Lads," Deakins announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let's see if the sergeant major can remember which end the bullet comes out of. Must be a while since he's done anything more strenuous than standing still." A few of the younger soldiers snickered, their eyes darting towards Thomas, expecting the usual embarrassed silence. Thomas didn't react. He just took another slow sip of his tea, his gaze unwavering. On the firing line, the humiliation continued. One by one, the guardsmen took their positions, firing their allotted rounds at the targets 25 meters downrange. The noise was a series of sharp, controlled cracks. Most of the soldiers shot adequately, their scores clustering in the average range. Deakins, however, was a confident shot. He placed his rounds in a tight group on the silhouette's chest, turning back to his mates with a theatrical nod of self-satisfaction. "See? Textbook. It's all about natural ability," he boasted. So then it was Thomas's turn. Deakins seized the opportunity. "All right, Grandpa," he called out, leaning against a concrete pillar. "Try not to fall over from the recoil, and remember, you're aiming for the bad guy, not the nice policeman standing next to him." The group behind him erupted in louder laughter, the sound echoing off the tiled walls. Thomas ignored them. He stepped into the lane, his movements deliberate and economical. He didn't just pick up the rifle, he seemed to merge with it. Because he checked the weapon with a speed and fluency that was almost hypnotic, his hands moving in a sequence so practiced it was pure muscle memory. He loaded the magazine, pulled back the charging handle, and settled the stock into his shoulder. The transformation was instantaneous. The stoic, elderly guardsman was gone. In his place was a predator, perfectly still and utterly focused. He fired his first round. The crack was sharp, but the effect on the range was one of sudden, stunned silence. The shot was perfect. Then another, and another. Thomas didn't fire in the controlled bursts the others had used. He fired in a seamless, fluid rhythm, each shot a perfect echo of the last. When he finished, the range officer called for the target to be brought forward. A young soldier walked down range and retrieved it, his face pale. He brought it back and held it up for everyone to see. A collective gasp went through the room. The shots had not just grouped together. They had created a single ragged hole in the exact center of the target's forehead, where the silhouette's nose met the brow. The other two rounds had followed the same path, tearing the paper to shreds. It was a feat of marksmanship that looked less like skill and more like a magic trick. Thomas calmly unloaded the weapon, placed the empty magazine on the bench, and stepped back, his face betraying no emotion. The only sound was the metallic click of the rifle's action and the stunned silence of 20 men who had just witnessed the impossible. Part 2. The silence that followed Thomas's display at the firing range was thick enough to cut with a knife. It stretched for a full 5 seconds, a void where the laughter had been, before being replaced by a low murmur of disbelief. Corporal Deakins' smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of slack-jawed confusion. He stared at the target, then at Thomas, and then back at the target, as if trying to find the trick, the hidden mechanism that had allowed this old man to perform such a feat. The range safety officer, a former Royal Marine himself, cleared his throat, his own eyes wide with respect. "Sergeant Major, that's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen," he stammered. Thomas simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He didn't look at Deakins or the other young soldiers. He didn't need to. The silence was vindication enough. The rest of the qualification passed in a strange, hushed atmosphere. The other guardsmen shot their rounds, but the cocky energy had evaporated. They were subdued, thoughtful, occasionally shooting furtive glances at the quiet man standing against the wall. Deakins didn't say another word for the rest of the session. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, replaying the scene in his mind. He had been shown up, not by a rival, but by a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. The humiliation was a bitter pill, and it sat heavily in his gut. The incident, however, did not end on the range. Word spread through the small, gossipy community of the Guard like wildfire. By the next morning, every soldier in the company had heard about the Sergeant Major's little trick. The story grew in the telling. Some said he'd shot the head clean off the target. Others whispered that he'd done it blindfolded. The truth, impressive as it was, became a legend overnight. This newfound notoriety had a strange effect on the dynamics of the guard. The mocking stopped immediately. No one dared make a joke at Thomas's expense, but the silence that replaced the mockery was, in its own way, just as isolating. The younger soldiers didn't know how to approach him. He was no longer just the quiet old man. He was an enigma, a figure of quiet, intimidating power. They kept their distance, and treating him with a wary respect that felt more like fear than genuine camaraderie. For Thomas, the attention was unwelcome. He hadn't fired those shots to prove a point or to humiliate deacons. He had simply done what he was trained to do. On the range, with a weapon in his hands, his body had reverted to its most fundamental programming. It was the only time he felt truly alive, truly himself. But the aftermath, the whispers and the stares, only reinforced his feelings of alienation. He was more of an outsider now than he had been before. A few days later, he was called into the office of the regimental lieutenant colonel. The RSM, a towering man named Regimental Sergeant Major Brown, was a classic old-school soldier, a stickler for protocol and tradition. He was also deeply suspicious of anything that disrupted the orderly flow of his battalion. He sat behind his large wooden desk, a sheaf of papers before him, and fixed Thomas with a hard stare. I've been hearing some interesting stories, Sergeant Major," RSM Brown began, his voice a low rumble, "about a little exhibition at the range." Thomas stood at ease, his gaze fixed on a point just above the RSM's head. "Just qualifying, sir." "Don't just qualifying me, man," Brown snapped, leaning forward. "I have a range report here that describes your shooting as beyond exceptional. I have a dozen guardsmen who can't talk about anything else. It's causing a distraction. It's unusual." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Your file is remarkably sparse, Sergeant Major. It lists your previous service as infantry, with a few basic training courses. That's it. And yet, a man doesn't learn to shoot like that on a basic training course." Thomas remained silent, his face a mask of stone. He knew this moment might come. The regiment, the SAS, operated in the shadows for a reason. Its members were taught to value discretion above all else, and their pasts were not for public consumption. RSM Brown continued, his tone shifting from accusatory to curious. "I've made a few inquiries, unofficially, of course, and I've hit a wall. Your records are sealed, classified. That doesn't happen for a standard infantryman." He leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with new eyes. "So, I'm going to ask you directly, Sergeant Major, and I expect an honest answer. What exactly did you do before you decided to come and play dress-up with my regiment?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas's mind flickered back to the oath he had taken, the bond of secrecy that was as strong as any brotherhood. But he was also a soldier, and a direct question from a superior officer demanded a response. He met the RSM's gaze for the first time. "Sir, with respect, my previous service is a matter of record, however sparse. I am currently a sergeant major in the King's Guard, and I perform my duties to the best of my ability. The past is the past." RSM Brown stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. He saw something in Thomas's eyes then, a depth and a hardness that he recognized. It was the look of a man who had seen things, done things, that were far beyond the experience of anyone in this room. He saw the ghost of a soldier, not a guardsman. Finally, he gave a curt nod. That he was a man who understood the need for secrets. "Very well, Sergeant Major, dismissed. But understand this," he added as Thomas turned to leave. "You've drawn attention to yourself. In this unit, that's not always a good thing." Thomas walked out of the office, the weight of the RSM's words settling on his shoulders. He had survived the scrutiny for now, but he knew the questions wouldn't stop. The legend of the palace guard who could shoot like a ghost was only just beginning. Part 3. The atmosphere in the guards' mess hall had fundamentally changed. Before the incident at the range, Thomas would have sat alone, invisible. Now he was a magnet for furtive glances and hushed conversations. He still sat alone, but the space around him felt like a cordon sanitaire, a bubble of respectful isolation. The younger soldiers no longer saw him as a fossil. They saw him as a force of nature they couldn't comprehend. Corporal Deakins, however, was struggling to adapt, and his ego had been badly bruised. For weeks he had been the alpha male of his peer group, the loudest voice, the sharpest wit. Now he was the man who had been silently, effortlessly, and publicly humiliated by a man twice his age. He couldn't let it go. It gnawed at him during drills, during guard duty, in the quiet hours of the night. His solution was not to seek understanding, but to double down on his skepticism. The story, he insisted to anyone who would listen, had to be a fluke. You don't just forget to be that good, he argued to a group of privates one evening over a game of cards. It's like riding a bike, yeah? But that wasn't just riding a bike. That was winning the Tour de France. There's no way a bloke his age, doing this boring job for years, just suddenly remembers he's a super soldier. The target must have been faulty, or the range officer was in on it. It's a trick, plain and simple. His audience nodded along, but their agreement was half-hearted, and they had seen the target. They had seen the look in Thomas's eyes. Deakins's campaign to debunk the legend reached a fever pitch when he learned about an upcoming joint training exercise. It was a weekend event held at a sprawling Ministry of Defense training area in the countryside designed to test basic infantry skills, navigation, patrolling, and most importantly, a complex multi-lane assault course that culminated in a stressful marksmanship drill. It was the perfect arena for a showdown. And Deakins managed to maneuver himself and several of his loyal followers onto the same squad as Thomas. He approached the weekend with the gleeful anticipation of a hunter. "Let's see how the legend performs when he's tired, hungry, and wet," he told his mates, a cruel smile on his face. "Anyone can stand still and shoot paper. Let's see him run around in the mud." The exercise began on a gray, drizzly Saturday morning. The first few events were physical. A timed road march with full kit, followed by a series of obstacle courses. Thomas did not excel. He was fit for his age, but his body bore the scars of 2 decades of hard service. Bad knees, a recurring back injury from an IED blast. He lagged behind the younger, fitter men, his face strained with effort. Deakins watched with growing satisfaction, loudly encouraging his squad while making pointed comments about keeping up. "Come on, Sergeant Major. The enemy's not going to wait for you to stretch your hamstrings." Thomas ignored the taunts, conserving his energy. He knew what this was. It was a setup. Deakins was trying to break him before the main event. He said nothing, just kept putting one foot in front of the other, his mind focused on a different rhythm, a different kind of endurance. The final event was the stress shoot. It was a half-mile run through muddy fields and dense woodland, leading to a firing range where soldiers, on heart-pounding and out of breath, had to engage a series of pop-up targets. Some were enemy silhouettes, some were innocent civilians. They had to make split-second decisions, shoot or don't shoot. By the time the squad reached the start line for the final run, the drizzle had turned into a steady, cold rain. The ground was a quagmire. Deakins and his cronies were eager, bouncing on their toes. Thomas stood quietly, adjusting his webbing, his face a grim mask. The whistle blew, and they were off. Deakins sprinted ahead, his young legs churning through the mud. He wanted to finish fast, to be waiting at the range with a condescending smile when Thomas finally staggered in. He tore through the woodland, branches whipping at his face, and burst onto the firing point, breathless but triumphant. He dropped to a kneeling position, raised his rifle, and began engaging the targets as they snapped up. He was hitting them, but his shots were wild, or his breathing too ragged to control his aim. He missed a civilian target completely, the range officer making a sharp note on his clipboard. He finished his course and stood, chest heaving, waiting for the others. One by one, his mates arrived, equally breathless, their shooting mediocre at best. They stood together, a panting, self-congratulatory group, waiting for the old man. Minutes passed. They began to smirk. "Maybe he got lost," one of them joked. "Or maybe he fell in a ditch and can't get up," Deakins added, earning a round of weary laughter. Then a figure emerged from the tree line. It was Thomas. But he wasn't running. He was walking at a steady, ground-eating pace, his breathing controlled and even. He hadn't tried to sprint the course. He had paced himself, conserving his energy, reading the terrain. As he approached the firing point, he didn't stop to catch his breath. He simply walked up to the mark, raised his rifle, and began. The range came alive. Targets snapped up in a seemingly random order. An enemy. Crack. A civilian holding a child, his rifle didn't move. An enemy behind a window. Crack. A woman with a gun. Crack. His shots were not wild. They were measured, deliberate, and absolutely precise. He moved through the course with a fluid, economical grace, his body calm, his mind processing the visual information with a speed that was almost superhuman. He wasn't reacting to the targets, he was flowing with them. When the last target fell, the range fell silent. Thomas unloaded his weapon and looked over at Deakins and his group. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The scoreboard told the story. Thomas had achieved a 100% hit rate on enemy targets with 0 civilian casualties, a feat considered nearly impossible under such stressful conditions. Deakins and his men stood frozen, the rain plastering their hair to their foreheads, their earlier mockery hanging in the air like a stale, poisonous fog. And in that moment they all knew, with absolute certainty, that they were in the presence of a true professional, a man who operated on a level they could never hope to reach. Part 4. The weekend exercise at the training area became a turning point, not just for how Thomas was perceived, but for the quiet man himself. The relentless physical challenge, the mud, the rain, the sharp crack of the rifle, it had all stirred something deep within him. For the first time in years, he hadn't felt like a man in a costume. He had felt like a soldier. The change was subtle, but noticeable to a trained eye. His posture on guard duty seemed less rigid, more at ease, as if the uniform had finally stopped chafing his soul. He still didn't engage in the banter of the guard room, but the impenetrable wall of silence around him seemed to have developed a small, unguarded door. A few weeks later, a new soldier joined the regiment. His name was Private Liam Gallagher, a fresh-faced 18-year-old from Manchester. Liam was quiet, observant, and utterly overwhelmed by the pomp and discipline of the King's Guard. He was clumsy during drill, forgot the names of his superiors, and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of nervous anxiety. He was the new bottom of the pecking order, and the Deakins crowd, happy to have a fresh target, circled him with relish. One afternoon, during a break in drill practice, Liam was sitting alone on a bench in a quiet corner of the Wellington Barracks parade ground, staring at his boots. He was trying to hide the fact that he was close to tears. He felt like a failure, a fraud in a scarlet uniform. He didn't hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel until a shadow fell over him. He looked up, startled to see Sergeant Major Thomas standing there, holding 2 paper cups of tea. "Mind if I sit?" Thomas asked. It was the first time Liam had ever heard him speak outside of a command. Liam could only nod, his eyes wide. Thomas sat down, handing him one of the cups. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the tourists mill about beyond the gates. "Hard, isn't it?" Thomas said eventually, his voice low. "The first few months, everything's new. Everyone seems to know what they're doing except you. You feel like you're wearing a sign that says idiot." Liam let out a shaky breath. "Yes, Sergeant Major." That's exactly it. Thomas took a sip of his tea. I know. I've been there. Not here. A different place. A long time ago. He was quiet for a moment, his pale blue eyes looking at something far away. The trick is, lad, not to try and be like them. They're loud because they're trying to prove something. You're quiet. That's not a weakness. In my experience, it's the quiet ones you have to watch. They're the ones who are thinking, and they're the ones who see things others miss. Liam listened, captivated. This was more than he had ever heard the man speak. But I keep messing up the drills, he confessed. Drills are just patterns, Thomas said. Your body has to learn them so your mind can be free. Free to think, to react, to see the thing that doesn't fit the pattern. Don't fight the drill. Become it. Let it become a habit, like breathing. He looked directly at Liam for the first time. You have good eyes, Private. As observant. Don't let anyone train that out of you. From that day on, a quiet mentorship began. Thomas never went out of his way to befriend Liam, but he was always there. He'd offer a quiet word of advice after a drill, correct his stance with a gentle hand, or share a bench during a break. He didn't teach him how to be a guardsman. He taught him how to be a soldier. He taught him about fieldcraft, about observation, about the importance of controlling his breathing to control his fear. And he taught him the things that weren't in the manual, the things you only learned from experience. The other soldiers noticed. Deakins, in particular, was incensed. His treatment of Liam intensified. He saw it as a proxy war, a way to get at Thomas. He would make loud, sarcastic comments about teacher's pet and the old man's new project. He would give Liam the worst duties, the most tedious tasks, always with a sneer and a cutting remark. One evening, in the barracks common room, and it came to a head. Liam was quietly reading a field manual Thomas had lent him, a dog-eared, annotated copy of an old SAS patrol guide. Deakins snatched it from his hands. "What's this, then?" he announced, holding it up. "Patrol craft. Bit advanced for you, isn't it, Gallagher? Planning on being a hero?" The room laughed. Deakins flipped through the pages, seeing the handwritten notes in the margins. "This isn't even official issue. This is just rubbish." He made a move as if to toss it into a nearby trash bin. Before the book left his hand, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "Put it down, Corporal." Everyone froze. Thomas was standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry. His face was completely calm, but his eyes were fixed on Deakins with an intensity that made the younger man's blood run cold. Deakins hesitated, his bravado crumbling under that gaze. He looked at the book in his hand, then at Thomas, then slowly, deliberately, and placed it on a nearby table. He muttered something under his breath and slunk away, the spell broken. Liam looked at Thomas, his eyes full of gratitude. Thomas gave him a short nod, then turned and left. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't pulled rank. He had simply asserted a dominance so absolute, so primal, that no one in that room, least of all Deakins, dared to challenge it. In that moment, the ghost had shown his power, not with a rifle, but with a look that had stared down death itself. Part 5. The confrontation in the common room was a watershed moment. It drew a clear line in the sand. On one side was Thomas, the enigmatic outsider, now with a single loyal recruit in Liam. On the other was Deakins, whose influence, while still potent among the more boisterous soldiers, was visibly waning. The silent majority of the regiment, the steady professional soldiers who just wanted to do their job, it now looked at Thomas with undisguised respect. He had defended the weak without a fuss, and had stood up to a bully without breaking a sweat. That was leadership, the kind you couldn't teach. A few weeks later, the regiment was thrown into a state of high alert. A major incident was unfolding in central London. A lone gunman, reportedly with a military background and suffering a mental breakdown, had barricaded himself inside a small hotel near Victoria Station. He was armed with a hunting rifle and had already fired several shots from a window, sending pedestrians scrambling for cover and tying up traffic for miles. The Metropolitan Police had surrounded the area, but their negotiators were getting nowhere. The man was erratic, shouting about government conspiracies and threatening to kill anyone who came close. The police had a problem. The hotel was on a narrow street, making a tactical entry extremely high risk. The man's position in a top-floor corner room gave him a commanding view of the approaches. A police sniper had a partial sight line, but it was through a gap in two buildings that was less than a foot wide and at a severe angle. The shot, if it was even possible, was measured at just over 800 meters, a distance well within the capability of a trained police marksman with a precision rifle. But the angle and the narrow window of opportunity made it a nightmare scenario. They needed a specialist. They needed someone who understood the complexities of urban wind currents, angle of deflection, and the psychology of a desperate target. A frantic call was put through to the Ministry of Defense. Did they have anyone who could assist? Someone with extraordinary long-range experience? The request filtered down through channels, past regiments and units, and until it reached the desk of a very senior officer who remembered a peculiar request he'd filed away months ago about a guardsman with sealed records. The officer picked up his phone. Back at Wellington Barracks, Thomas was preparing for a routine guard mount when he was summoned to the RSM's office. This time, RSM Brown wasn't behind his desk. He was standing, his face pale. With him were two men in plain clothes, their bearing giving away their military or police background instantly. "Or Sergeant Major," the RSM said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. "There's a situation. These gentlemen are from SCO 19, the Metropolitan Police's armed unit. They need to speak with you." One of the men, a grizzled veteran with tired eyes, stepped forward. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the situation at the hotel, the impossible shot, and the ticking clock. "We've been told," he said, looking Thomas directly in the eye, "that you might be the only person in London who can make this shot. We don't have time to verify your credentials, we just need to know. Can you do it?" The room was silent. RSM Brown watched, his jaw slack. He had suspected Thomas had a past, but this was something else entirely. Thomas looked at the map, the photos of the hotel, the ballistic calculations the police had hastily drawn up. He didn't see a hotel. He saw a target. He saw wind speed, angle, the curvature of the earth. He saw the face of a broken man who was about to die. He was quiet for 10 long seconds, his mind running through 1,000 scenarios he had lived through before. "Yes," he said simply, "I can."